There are lives so gilded they seem immune to the grit and sorrow of ordinary existence. Lives lived in sprawling country estates with names like legends, behind the velvet ropes of exclusive clubs, and in the bright, popping glare of society photographers. From the outside, these lives look like fairy tales, collections of perfect moments, blessed by an abundance of fortune, seemingly untouched by the tragedies that stalk the rest of us. But sometimes, the brightest gilding hides the deepest rot. And sometimes an inheritance isn't a gift of cash and heirlooms, but a curse, passed down through generations like a faulty gene. This is the story of a man who inherited everything a person could possibly want: a legendary American name, a fortune so vast it was almost abstract, and a birthright at the very pinnacle of society. He was handsome, whip-smart, and by all accounts a kind and gentle soul. Yet he would spend the entirety of his life trying to outrun a ghost, not a spectral apparition, but the deafening echo of a single shotgun blast that ripped through the silence of his childhood. He tried, with every fiber of his being, to build a new life, a different identity, a world away from the secrets and the lies that were his birthright. But in the end, the curse of his name, a legacy of trauma meticulously papered over with money, would prove inescapable. This is the story of William Woodward III, or Billy as he was known, the man who had everything except a chance at peace. To understand the curse, you first have to understand the kingdom it came from. The Woodward dynasty was American royalty, a foundational pillar of the exclusive, powerful, and intensely private world of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment that quietly ran the country in the mid-20th century. The family fortune was old, solid, and staggeringly vast, rooted in the Hanover Bank, which Billy's grandfather, the formidable William Woodward Sr., had led as president. He was a man of immense ambition and influence, a friend to presidents, a figure who moved with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who owned a piece of the world. But the true ruler of this kingdom was his wife, Elsie Crider Woodward. Elsie was not merely a society hostess. She was the supreme arbiter, the gatekeeper of the inner circle. A descendant of one of New York's oldest families, she possessed an unshakable sense of her own place in the social firmament. Her pronouncements, delivered with a cool patrician air, could make or break a reputation in the drawing rooms of Park Avenue and the sprawling cottages of Newport. To be accepted by Elsie Woodward was to have arrived. To be shunned by her was social death. The crown jewel of their empire wasn't a bank vault, but a legend, the Bel Air Stud in Maryland. This was not just a farm, it was a cathedral of horse racing, one of the most prestigious thoroughbred stables in history, with a lineage stretching back to the 18th century. Bel Air produced champions that became national heroes like Gallant Fox and his son Omaha, two of the very few horses to ever win the Triple Crown. For the Woodwards, these horses were more than a hobby. They were a living symbol of their own pedigree, their mastery, their philosophy of breeding, and discipline producing an unbroken line of excellence. Into this world of immense privilege and suffocating expectation, William Billy Woodward Jr. was born. As the heir apparent, his life was a track laid out for him. He was groomed to take over the family empire, attending the right schools, joining the right clubs. He served with distinction as a naval officer during World War II and returned a decorated hero. 2. He was staggeringly handsome, effortlessly charming, and possessed the easy, almost arrogant confidence of a man who had never known a day of struggle. His life's first and only major deviation from the plan came when he fell in love with Anne Crowell. Anne was everything the Woodwards were not. A former radio actress and model, she came from a poor background in Pittsburgh, Kansas. She was vibrant, ambitious, outspoken, and possessed a dazzling beauty that men found irresistible. She had been married before and worked as a showgirl at a high-end Miami nightclub, a fact that the old guard, and especially Elsie, would never forget. To them, she was an adventuress, a stunning but common outsider who had somehow managed to snare their golden boy. The press, captivated by her looks and backstory, called her Anne the Tantalizer. Despite his mother's icy disapproval, Billy Jr. was utterly smitten. Their wedding in 1943 was a major society event, a flash of new glamour injected into a staid and ancient world. They were the golden couple. They had 2 sons, William III, our Billy, born in 1944, and James, known as Jimmy, who arrived 3 years later. They settled on a magnificent 50-acre estate in Oyster Bay, Long Island, a community of old money and even older secrets. From the outside, their life was idyllic. The 2 boys grew up surrounded by a level of wealth that bordered on the surreal. They had ponies, swimming pools, tennis courts, and a full staff to cater to every whim. It was a childhood seemingly plucked from the pages of an F. Scott Fitzgerald novel. But beneath the polished, sun-dappled surface, the marriage between Billy Jr. and Anne was a glittering ruin. He was aloof, emotionally distant, and controlling, a true son of the Woodward clan. Anne, desperate for the affection he withheld, and forever feeling like an outsider in her own home, was fiery and notoriously flirtatious. Their arguments became legendary among their staff. Their infidelities were an open secret within their elite social circle. The storybook castle had a deep and incurable rot in its foundations, and the 2 young boys, Billy and Jimmy, were living right on top of it. Then, on a cold, fateful autumn night in 1955, the foundation gave way completely, and the entire edifice came crashing down. On the evening of October 30th, 1955, a palpable fear was in the air in the wealthy enclaves of Long Island. A prowler, dubbed the Jewel Thief by the press, had been targeting the sprawling, isolated estates, and residents were on high alert. That night, Billy Jr. and Anne attended a dinner party hosted by their neighbors in honor of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. By all accounts, the couple was tense. They returned home late to their estate, Hillside. According to Anne's later testimony, they were both unnerved by the prowler reports. They made a decision that would alter the course of their family forever. They would each sleep with a loaded shotgun nearby. Billy Jr. retired to his bedroom and Anne to hers, a separate chamber down the hall. In the dead of night, around 2 a.m., a single deafening gunshot blasted through the opulent silence of the house. Anne Woodward stood in the darkened hallway, a double-barreled shotgun still smoking in her hands. In the doorway to her husband's bedroom lay Billy Jr., dead from a massive wound to the head. Her story was immediate, hysterical, and unwavering. She had heard a noise, thought it was the prowler climbing the stairs, saw a shadowy figure in the darkness, and fired. It was a tragic, horrific accident. The boys, 11-year-old Billy and 8-year-old Jimmy, were asleep in their rooms down the hall. They awoke to a world of absolute chaos, their mothers' piercing screams, the frantic movements of the household staff, and soon the disorienting arrival of police officers and flashbulbs. In the center of it all was the terrifying, permanent, and unexplainable absence of their father. Before long, the matriarch, Elsie Woodward, was summoned from her Manhattan mansion. She arrived on the scene not like a grieving mother-in-law, but like a 5-star general arriving at a battlefield. Her priority was not sorrow, it was damage control. The Woodward name, the most valuable asset the family possessed, was at stake. The scandal had to be contained, and contained it was, with an efficiency that was both breathtaking and deeply suspicious. Elsie wielded the full, immense power of the Woodward influence. She called her high-powered lawyer, who seemed to materialize at the estate. The narrative was shaped and set in stone before the sun came up. The local Nassau County Police were deferential, their investigation strangely lacking in rigor. Key questions were never properly pursued. Why was Billy Jr.'s bedroom door open when he always slept with it closed? Why did Anne fire both barrels of the shotgun, an act that requires 2 separate trigger pulls? Despite these inconsistencies, despite whispers from the staff about a violent argument that night, the official story held firm. It was a tragic accident. In a stroke of convenient timing, a known burglar named Paul Worths was arrested 2 days later, and though he denied ever being at the Woodward estate, he became the convenient face of the prowler. The machinery of justice moved with a speed reserved only for the very powerful. A grand jury was convened, and after hearing from Anne and a handful of other witnesses in a session that lasted just 28 minutes, they declined to indict her. Anne Woodward was legally, officially innocent. But society has its own jury, one that cannot be swayed by powerful lawyers. While the law cleared her, the world she had so desperately wanted to conquer turned its back on her with a chilling finality. She was branded the Bang Bang Girl, ostracized, snubbed, and endlessly whispered about. She became a pariah. For young Billy and Jimmy, the public nightmare was just beginning. Their father was gone, murdered by a shadow. Their mother, while physically present, was now a ghost herself, a figure of notoriety and scorn, forever defined by that single violent moment. The boys were unmoored. Soon, they were sent to live with their grandmother Elsie in the cavernous, opulent Woodward mansion on Fifth Avenue. Here, in this grand and lonely museum of a home, an unspoken rule was established with iron certainty. The shooting of their father, the most significant event of their lives, was never, ever to be discussed. A thick, impenetrable wall of silence was erected around their trauma, a silence that would prove just as destructive as the gunshot itself. Billy Woodward III grew from a boy into a man in the chilling shadow of that silence. He was a quiet, deeply sensitive, and fiercely intelligent child, forced to navigate a world where his own family history was the ultimate taboo subject. He and his younger brother Jimmy were bound together by their shared, unspeakable trauma. They were the boys whose mother had killed their father, a lurid fact the entire world seemed to know and whisper about, but one that no one in their own home would ever acknowledge. This psychological burden is almost impossible for most of us to comprehend. Every polite conversation at the dinner table, every society gathering they were forced to attend, was underscored by the deafening sound of what was left unsaid. They were sent to St. Mark's School, an elite boarding school in Massachusetts, where they were known simply as the Woodward Boys, a label that carried with it a whole history of tragedy. Billy excelled. He retreated into books and ideas, finding a refuge in the world of the mind. He graduated and went to Harvard University, as was expected of a Woodward, but here he made a definitive break with his destiny. He felt no pull toward the world of banking or high finance that had defined his father and grandfather. He was drawn to words, to social justice, to the messy, vibrant world that existed far outside the gilded cage of his upbringing. After graduating from Harvard in 1966, he seemed to be making a conscious, deliberate effort to forge an identity entirely separate from his name. He moved to New York City, and in a move that must have horrified the old guard, began working as a reporter for the Village Voice, a bastion of radical counterculture and left-wing politics. He later worked for New York Magazine and eventually became the co-publisher of a London-based publication called Gambit. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant journalist and a man of deep progressive convictions. He wrote about politics, civil rights, and the struggles of ordinary people, subjects anathema to the Oyster Bay set. He was actively rebelling against his own class. He fell in love with and married an Englishwoman named Angela, a union that seemed to provide him with a measure of stability and normalcy. They had a daughter, Elsie, named for the matriarch, but destined for a different life. For a time, it looked as if Billy had actually done it. He had managed to break the curse. He had built a life on his own terms, defined by his intellect, his work, and his own small family, not by the Gothic tragedy of his parents. His brother Jimmy was not so fortunate. Jimmy was more volatile, more outwardly haunted by the past. He seemed to have absorbed the family trauma in a different way, carrying it not as a quiet, internal weight like Billy, but as a raw, open wound. He drifted aimlessly, dabbled in drugs, and seemed constitutionally unable to find his footing in the world. He was a constant, painful reminder of the damage that had been done. Despite their different paths, the two brothers remained incredibly close, their bond forged in the crucible of that silent mansion, their shared secret a constant presence in their lives. They were survivors, but they were surviving on borrowed time, and their time was about to be called in by a man armed not with a shotgun, but with a pen. That man was Truman Capote. In the 1960s and early 70s, Capote was a literary god. After the monumental genre-defining success of In Cold Blood, he was more than just a writer. He was a phenomenon, a celebrated court jester to the very high society he so brilliantly chronicled. He was a confidant, a father-confessor to the rich and powerful women he famously called his swans. These women, Babe Paley, Slim Keith, Gloria Vanderbilt, adored him, and they told him everything, trusting him with their darkest, most intimate secrets. Anne Woodward, still a pariah but desperate to cling to the edges of society, was one of them. She, too, unburdened herself to the witty, seemingly harmless author. For years, Capote had been promising his masterpiece, a novel to be called Answered Prayers. It was meant to be his modern-day American version of Proust's In Search of Lost Time, a searing, epic takedown of the jet set he knew so well. But the book wasn't coming. Years passed, the advance was spent, and the pages remained blank. In 1975, desperate for cash and facing pressure from his publisher, his editor convinced him to publish an excerpt in Esquire magazine. The chapter was titled La Côte Basque, 1965, named after the chic Manhattan restaurant where his swans gathered to trade gossip over lunch. What appeared in the November issue of Esquire was not fiction. It was a social atom bomb. It was a thinly veiled, almost verbatim transcription of the most scandalous secrets his swans had ever told him, and at its rotten core was the Woodward story. Capote created a character named Anne Hopkins, a beautiful but vulgar woman who marries into a powerful family. He described her being taunted by her mother-in-law. Then he described the night of the shooting, but Capote added a vicious final twist that went far beyond mere gossip. He invented a character, a friend of the murdered husband, who reveals the truth. She shot him. I mean intentionally. There was no prowler. David had found out that she was fucking a night watchman, and he was going to divorce her, and she killed him. The publication of La Côte Basque was an act of spectacular social suicide. Capote's swans, seeing their darkest secrets laid bare for public consumption, cut him off instantly and completely. He was banished from the world he had both loved and loathed. But the truly devastating impact was on the Woodward family. For 20 years, Billy and Jimmy had lived with the official story, the tragic accident. They may have harbored their own private doubts, their own dark, unformed questions. But the public narrative, the one so carefully constructed by their grandmother, was their only shield against the horror. Capote ripped that shield away. He didn't just retell the story, he publicly, and in a respected literary magazine, accused their mother of premeditated murder and their grandmother of a massive criminal cover-up. He had taken their most private and profound trauma and turned it into sensational best-selling entertainment. The consequences were swift and catastrophic. Someone, to this day, no one knows who, sent an advance copy of the Esquire issue to Anne Woodward. After 2 decades of living as a social leper, this was the final unbearable blow. It was the public confirmation of everyone's worst whispers, penned by a man she had considered a friend. On October 9, 1975, Anne Woodward committed suicide by swallowing a cyanide pill. Upon hearing the news of her death, Capote, ever the performer, delivered one of the cruelest lines in literary history. Well, what did they expect? I'm a writer. I'm not a concierge. For Billy and Jimmy, the carefully constructed wall of silence had been obliterated by a wrecking ball. Their mother was now dead, driven to suicide by the public resurrection of their father's death. The curse was no longer a quiet, haunting ghost. It was a raging, all-consuming inferno. The 1-2 punch of Capote's betrayal and their mother's suicide sent the Woodward brothers into a final irreversible tailspin. The fragile peace that Billy had worked so hard and so long to build was shattered into a million pieces. The past he had so successfully outrun for a time had circled back and caught him in the most brutal way imaginable. It was Jimmy who succumbed first. Always the more fragile of the two, the one who wore his wounds on the outside, he fell deeper into heroin addiction. He felt the shame and the horror of the family legacy with an intensity that he could not medicate away. Friends recalled him being tormented, endlessly reliving the events, trapped in a nightmarish loop of grief and scandal. In 1978, just 3 years after his mother's death, Jimmy Woodward checked himself into the Mayfair House Hotel in Manhattan. There, at the age of 31, he climbed out of a 9th-story window and jumped to his death. His friends said that in his final months he had been talking about Capote constantly, obsessing over the story that had destroyed what little was left of his family. Billy was now utterly, terrifyingly alone. He was the sole inheritor of the entire tragic saga. He was the last man standing on a stage littered with the bodies of his family. He now bore the full crushing weight of his father's violent death, his mother's decades of ostracism and eventual suicide, and now his beloved brother's final desperate act of despair. It is a psychological burden that simply defies imagination. He tried valiantly to carry on. He had his wife Angela, his daughter Elsie. He had his work. He continued to be a loving father and a dedicated professional. But a profound depression, a deep, inescapable melancholy that friends called the Woodward gloom, had taken permanent root in his soul. He felt haunted, not by supernatural phantoms, but by the very real ghosts of his family. He reportedly told friends that he felt a complete lack of control over his own life, that the narrative of his family, now cemented in the public imagination by Capote's poisoned pen, had completely overwhelmed his own. He was no longer Billy Woodward, the progressive journalist, the loving husband and father. In the eyes of the world, and perhaps in his own, he was simply the son of the woman who shot his father, and the brother of the man who jumped. The curse was no longer just a part of his story. It was his story. It was his entire identity. He fought it for 2 more decades, a long, slow, quiet war of attrition against his own mind. He moved his family to San Francisco, perhaps seeking the anonymity of a new coast, a final attempt to escape the whispers of New York. But the ghost came with him. His depression deepened. The immense fortune he had inherited felt less like a comfort and more like blood money, a constant, tangible reminder of the tragedy that had enabled it. The weight of it all, the secrets, the lies, the deaths, the relentless public narrative finally became too much to bear. On May 1st, 1999, 21 years after his brother's death, William Woodward III walked to the window of his 14th floor apartment in Manhattan, having recently moved back to the city that was the scene of all his family's triumphs and tragedies. He was 55 years old. He had inherited a kingdom, but all he had ever known of it was its ruins. And with one final tragic act of despair, an act that mirrored his brother's so closely, he jumped. So what was the Woodward curse? In the end, it wasn't a supernatural hex or a string of cosmic bad luck. The curse was the silence. It was the toxic, corrosive belief, so common among the powerful and the privileged, that appearances are more important than truth, that secrets can be buried with enough money, and that trauma, if it is ignored with sufficient discipline, will simply fade away. The Woodward family had all the resources in the world, the best lawyers, the best schools, the best connections, but they lacked the one thing that might have saved them: the courage to talk to each other, to grieve openly, to face the horror of what had happened in that darkened hallway and call it by its name. Billy Woodward III's life was a long, valiant, and ultimately failed struggle against this terrible inheritance. He tried to live a life of truth and conviction in a family that was built on secrets and lies. He championed the stories of the downtrodden while being forbidden to speak of his own. His tragic end serves as a profound and heartbreaking reminder that wealth cannot buy immunity from pain. Money can build walls, it can manage the press, it can create a flawless public facade, but it cannot heal a wounded heart. It cannot quiet the echo of a gunshot in a child's memory. The story of Billy Woodward is not just a salacious high society scandal. It's a deeply human American tragedy about the desperate search for identity and the crushing, inescapable weight of the past. It's about a kind, gentle man who was given everything a person could dream of, except the one thing he truly needed: the freedom to be himself, separate from the gilded, tragic, and ultimately cursed name he was born with. He spent a lifetime trying to escape the long shadow of his family, only to become its final, most heartbreaking victim.